I should have known something was off when I saw the birthday card. It wasn't the card itself. It was a standard Hallmark, bright colors, a cheerful font, the kind of card that gets passed around the office for everyone to sign. What caught my attention was the handwriting. Neat, feminine, and entirely too familiar. My name's Daniel Carter, and up until 3 weeks ago, I thought my life was as close to perfect as a man could hope for. I had a steady job managing logistics at a distribution company, a mortgage on a modest but comfortable house in suburban Indianapolis, and a marriage of 10 years to my high school sweetheart, Lauren. We weren't flashy, but we were solid. Or so I thought. The card was sitting on my coworker Sam's desk when I stopped by his office that afternoon. It was his birthday, so I'd swung by to wish him well. Sam's a good guy, always cracking jokes and keeping the mood light. He was on a call, gesturing for me to hang out for a second, so I leaned against the doorframe and waited. That's when I noticed it. The card. Lauren's handwriting. A quick, familiar message. Happy birthday, Sam. Hope it's as amazing as you are. And at the end, a little heart. At first, I thought I must have been mistaken. It wasn't like Lauren had an uncommon handwriting style, and people draw little hearts all the time, right? But as I stood there, staring at that card, a sick feeling started to settle in my stomach. It wasn't just the handwriting or the heart. It was the way she always seemed to light up when I mentioned Sam's name. The way she'd suddenly started paying more attention to her appearance before I dropped her off at her office in the mornings. The same office building where Sam worked, 3 floors below her. Sam ended his call and grinned at me. Thanks for stopping by, Dan. You got to sign the card before you leave. It's tradition. I forced a laugh, picked up the pen, and scrawled my name at the bottom of the card. My hand felt like it wasn't mine, as though someone else was guiding the pen. I barely noticed what I wrote. My mind was too busy racing, piecing together little fragments of the past few months. Her late nights at work, the extra gym sessions, the new lingerie she'd bought, but never worn for me. I walked back to my desk in a daze, the sick feeling growing with every step. Lauren was my wife, the mother of my 2 boys, the woman I'd promised to spend my life with. I'd never even considered the possibility that she could betray me. But now, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. That night, I couldn't stop myself from bringing it up. I didn't mention the card, but I asked her about work, about Sam, about why she'd been so distant lately. She rolled her eyes, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. You're imagining things, Daniel. Stop being so insecure. I'm not your little housewife. I have a life outside of you. Her words stung, but what hurt more was the look in her eyes. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was disdain, like she was annoyed that I dared to question her, like I was beneath her. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside me. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel like we were a team. I felt like a stranger in my own home, but I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Not yet. I needed proof. And if there's one thing I've learned in my years managing logistics, it's that the devil is in the details. Lauren thought she was clever. She thought I'd never noticed the little signs, the subtle shifts in her behavior. But she underestimated me. And as I lay there in the dark, the seed of a plan began to take root in my mind. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make her regret ever thinking she could play me for a fool. She thought she was so smart, so untouchable. But she was about to learn that the most dangerous man is the one you've underestimated. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. Lauren barely stirred when I kissed her on the forehead before heading out the door. It was an old habit, a gesture I hadn't thought twice about in years, but this time it felt hollow. A routine, nothing more. At work, I couldn't concentrate. The logistics reports that normally required my full attention blurred together, the words and numbers meaningless. My thoughts kept circling back to that card, to Lauren's dismissive tone, to the gnawing sense that I was living in a house built on sand. By lunch, I decided that I needed answers. Cold, hard answers. No more guessing, no more speculating. If Lauren had nothing to hide, she'd never know what I was doing. If she did, well, I needed to know what kind of battlefield I was standing on. That evening, after the kids were in bed and Lauren had retreated to her usual spot on the couch with a glass of wine and her phone, I slipped out to the garage. Hidden among the clutter of tools and holiday decorations was a box I hadn't touched in years. It contained an old laptop I used before upgrading, a relic from the days when I thought building furniture on weekends would turn into a profitable side hustle. I powered it up, updated the software, and downloaded a tracking program I'd read about in a forum once. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. The app would mirror her phone's activity on mine without her ever knowing. Messages, calls, even her GPS location. I'd have access to it all. When I went back inside, Lauren was still on the couch, scrolling with one hand and sipping wine with the other. She barely looked up when I passed by, muttering something about her boss being a nightmare and how she might have to work late again tomorrow. I forced a smile, keeping my voice even. "You've been working so hard lately. You deserve a break." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. If I waited for a break, we'd all be living on the streets. Her words stung, but I let it go. Instead, I kissed her goodnight and went to bed, pretending to fall asleep while she stayed up, her phone lighting up the room every few minutes. The next morning, the app was running. While I sat at my desk, pretending to focus on quarterly shipping projections, I watched as Lauren texted Sam about a meeting they had scheduled that afternoon. The tone of their messages was casual, almost professional. Almost. By mid-afternoon, I got my first real confirmation. A message popped up, Lauren to Sam. Same time and place? "The boss thinks I'm still here working on the Stratton project." Sam replied with a thumbs-up emoji and the address of a nearby cafe I knew was out of the way, quiet, perfect for a private conversation. I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening in a fist beneath the desk. So this was what her work really looked like. Instead of going home after work, I drove to the cafe, parking a few blocks away and walking the rest of the distance. My heart was pounding, my stomach in knots, but I kept my head down, my cap pulled low over my eyes. I spotted them immediately, sitting at a table near the window. Lauren was laughing, her hand on Sam's arm, leaning in closer than she ever did with me. He was grinning, his posture relaxed, like he didn't have a care in the world. Like he wasn't sitting there with another man's wife. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos, making sure to get clear shots of both their faces. Proof. I wasn't going to give her the chance to lie her way out of this. When I got home that night, Lauren was already there, acting like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and served dinner with a smile that made my skin crawl. I played along, joking with the kids, complimenting her cooking, pretending everything was fine. But as I sat there, watching her laugh and chat with our boys, I realized just how deep her betrayal cut. This wasn't just about me. This was about our family, the life we'd built together, the trust she'd shattered. She thought she could have it all, the stable husband, the perfect family, the excitement of whatever she had with Sam. But she was wrong. She couldn't have it all. Not anymore. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the pieces of my plan started falling into place. Revenge wasn't just about making her pay. It was about taking back control. She wanted to play games, to rewrite the rules of our marriage. Fine, I'd play along. But in the end, I'd be the one holding all the cards. The next morning, Lauren was in full devoted wife mode. She hummed while making the boys' lunches, fussed over Maddie's messy ponytail, and kissed me on the cheek before I left for work. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought things were normal. But the images of her with Sam at that cafe were burned into my mind, a constant reminder of the act she was putting on. At work, I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling around her betrayal and the growing need to do something about it. Confronting her now would be satisfying, sure, but it would also be predictable. She'd twist it, turn herself into the victim, and I'd come out looking like the bad guy. No, I needed to be smarter. I needed to make sure that when everything fell apart, there'd be no room for doubt about whose fault it was. That evening, after the boys were asleep and Lauren had gone to bed, I pulled out the old laptop again. The tracking app was working flawlessly, and I spent hours scrolling through her texts, piecing together the timeline of her affair with Sam. It wasn't just lunches and coffee dates. There were hotel reservations, late-night messages, and even a few photos that made my stomach churn. As I read through her messages, a pattern began to emerge. She wasn't just cheating, she was rationalizing it. In her conversations with Sam, she painted me as the villain, a cold, unloving husband who didn't appreciate her, didn't make her feel special. She claimed she stayed with me for the kids, that she felt trapped in a life that wasn't hers. It was infuriating, but it also gave me clarity. Lauren was rewriting the story of our marriage, and if I didn't act, that narrative would become the truth. She'd leave me, take the kids, and play the martyr while I was left to pick up the pieces. Not on my watch. The next phase of my plan required patience and precision. I needed more than just texts and photos. I needed undeniable proof. Something so clear, so damning, that even her excuses couldn't twist it. That weekend, I took the boys to the park, giving Lauren the day off she claimed she so desperately needed. In reality, it gave me the opportunity to set up hidden cameras in the house. They were small, discreet, and strategically placed in areas where she spent most of her time. Her office, the living room, even the kitchen. If she was going to slip up, I'd catch it. I also made a point of being extra attentive, playing the role of the loving, clueless husband. I brought her flowers, cooked dinner, and even suggested a date night. She acted surprised, almost suspicious, but she didn't turn me down. If anything, she seemed relieved, like my sudden affection absolved her of her guilt. Good. Let her think I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me. It didn't take long for the cameras to pay off. The following Wednesday, while I was at work, Lauren invited Sam over. I watched the live feed from my phone, my blood boiling as I saw them laughing on the couch, his hand resting on her thigh like it belonged there. They kissed, their intimacy so casual it made me feel like a stranger in my own home. I recorded everything, every laugh, every touch, every whispered word. By the time Sam left, I had more than enough evidence to destroy whatever fantasy world they'd built together. That night, as Lauren sat across from me at the dinner table, chatting about her day like nothing had happened, I felt a strange sense of calm. She thought she was in control, that she could keep me in the dark forever. But she didn't realize I wasn't just watching her. I was planning my next move. She wanted excitement, drama, a break from the monotony of married life. Fine, I'd give her excitement, but it wouldn't be the kind she was hoping for. As I lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep while she scrolled through her phone beside me, I couldn't help but smile. The pieces were all falling into place, and soon enough, Lauren would realize just how big of a mistake she'd made. She thought she was the one rewriting the rules, but I was the one who'd end the game. The following days felt like a game of chess, with each move carefully calculated. Lauren continued her charade of normalcy, slipping into her role as the dutiful wife and mother with ease. I played along, acting like the oblivious husband, letting her believe she had the upper hand. The tension simmered beneath the surface, a silent war neither of us acknowledged. But the cracks were starting to show. On Friday evening, while we were watching a movie with the boys, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting just enough for me to notice. She stood, muttering something about needing to grab a drink of water, and disappeared into the kitchen. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. The hidden camera in the kitchen gave me a front row seat. She leaned against the counter, typing furiously. The tension in her posture was palpable, her fingers flying across the screen as though her life depended on it. A few seconds later, I received a notification from the tracking app. Her conversation with Sam was unfolding in real time. Her text read, "Can't tonight. He's watching me too closely. Next week?" Sam replied, "You're overthinking it. He's clueless. Just tell him you're working late." She hesitated before responding, "I don't know. He's been acting strange lately. Like he knows something." My lips curled into a bitter smile as I watched her pace the kitchen. So, she was starting to notice. Good. Let her squirm. The next day, I decided to stir the pot. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned that I'd be working late the following Friday. Her reaction was immediate. Just a flicker of relief that she quickly masked with a smile. "That sounds like a good idea," she said, her tone overly bright. "You've been working so hard lately. You deserve a little time to catch up." It was almost laughable how easily the lie slipped from her lips. I played my part, nodding in agreement and pretending not to notice the way her eyes lit up, as though she were already planning her next move. Throughout the week, I continued gathering evidence, filling in the gaps in the timeline of her affair. Every text, every call, Every rendezvous was another piece of the puzzle, and by Thursday night, I had everything I needed. The pictures, the recordings, the messages. It was all there, neatly compiled into a folder I'd labeled Lauren's Truth. But I wasn't done yet. Confronting her with the evidence would be satisfying, sure, but it wouldn't be enough. I wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, to understand the full scope of her betrayal. And for that, I needed to get creative. On Friday, I left the house as planned, telling Lauren I'd be working late. I parked my car a few blocks away and walked back, slipping into the house through the garage. The boys were at a friend's house for the night, so the house was quiet, save for the faint hum of Lauren's music playing upstairs. I waited in the shadows, watching as she primped in front of the mirror, her phone buzzing intermittently with texts from Sam. He was already at the hotel, waiting for her. She finished getting ready, grabbed her purse, and slipped out the door. Once she was gone, I moved quickly. I logged into her laptop, pulling up the messages she thought were private, and saving copies of the most damning ones. Then I accessed the hidden cameras, downloading the footage from her previous encounters with Sam. Everything went into the folder, a damning archive that left no room for denial. Finally, I crafted an email. It was short and to the point, addressed to Lauren, Sam, and a handful of others, her boss, her parents, and a few mutual friends. Attached to the email was the Lauren's Truth folder. The email wasn't scheduled to send until Sunday morning. I wanted to give her one last night of freedom, one final illusion of control, before everything came crashing down. When Lauren returned home that night, I was sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. She froze when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. "I thought you were working late," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Change of plans," I replied, taking a sip. "How was your night?" She hesitated, then plastered on a smile. "Quiet. Just caught up on some reading." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the stairs. "Well, I'm exhausted," she said finally. "I think I'll head to bed." "Good night, Lauren," I said, watching her retreat. She didn't look back. As I sat there in the dark, the whiskey burning in my throat, I felt an eerie sense of calm. Lauren thought she'd outmaneuvered me, that she was still in control of the narrative. But she didn't realize the storm that was about to hit. The next 48 hours would change everything. And when it was over, she'd understand what it felt like to lose everything she'd taken for granted. She thought she could rewrite the rules of our marriage, but she was about to learn the hard way that some betrayals come with a cost. Saturday passed in uneasy silence. Lauren went about her day as though nothing was wrong, occasionally glancing at her phone with that guarded expression I'd come to recognize. She was playing her role to perfection, but so was I. Every smile, every casual word, was a mask concealing the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. By evening, the tension in the house was palpable. Lauren cooked dinner, chatting about mundane things, new projects at work, the boys' upcoming soccer games. But her words felt hollow, like she was talking to fill the silence rather than engage. I nodded, smiled, and pretended to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. The email was scheduled to send in less than 12 hours, and the weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on my chest. Later that night, after Lauren went to bed, I sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the clock. Every tick of the second hand felt like a countdown to detonation. I'd spent weeks planning this moment, gathering evidence, crafting the perfect strategy to dismantle the facade Lauren had built. And now that the end was in sight, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Around midnight, I pulled out my laptop and opened a draft of the email. I read through it one last time, checking the attachments, making sure everything was in place. The Lauren's Truth folder was a damning collection of texts, photos, and videos, each one meticulously organized to tell the story of her betrayal. There was no room for interpretation, no space for excuses. I stared at the send button, my finger hovering over the mouse. Part of me wanted to click it right then, to rip the bandage off and watch the fallout in real time. But I forced myself to wait. Timing was everything, and Sunday morning was the perfect moment to ensure maximum impact. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. When I finally drifted off, it was fitful, my dreams haunted by fragments of memories. The early days of our marriage, the laughter we used to share, the trust we once had. It was like mourning a ghost, the shadow of a life I'd thought was unshakable. Sunday morning arrived with an almost eerie stillness. The house was quiet, the boys still asleep, and Lauren sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She looked so composed, so unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I watched her from the doorway, my expression carefully neutral. The email was set to go out in 15 minutes, and the weight of anticipation pressed heavily on my chest. Lauren glanced up, catching my eye, and smiled. "You're up early," she said, her tone light. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "How about you? Sleep well?" She shrugged, her gaze flickering back to her phone. "Like a rock. You know me." I nodded, taking a sip of coffee to hide the smirk threatening to spread across my face. The irony was almost too much. She had no idea that her carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down. When the clock hit 8 a.m., I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. The email was sent. Lauren's phone buzzed a second later, the notification lighting up her screen. She frowned, opening the email, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she scrolled through the contents. Her face went pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the phone. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking, "what is this?" I set my coffee down, meeting her panicked gaze with cold indifference. "You know exactly what it is, Lauren." She stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You sent this to everyone? My boss? My parents? And Sam?" I added, my tone sharp. "Don't forget him." Her breathing grew ragged, her eyes wide with desperation. "You've ruined me, Daniel. You've ruined my life." "No, Lauren," I said, standing to face her. "You ruined your life. I just made sure everyone saw the truth." She paced the kitchen, muttering under her breath, her hands trembling as she typed furiously on her phone. She tried calling Sam, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried her boss next, her voice cracking as she left a message, begging for a chance to explain. Each call, each frantic message, only solidified the weight of what she'd done. By the time the boys woke up, Lauren was a wreck, her usual composure shattered. She avoided their questions, brushing off their concerns with forced smiles and excuses. But I could see the cracks widening, the reality of her situation sinking in. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Lauren finally confronted me. She stood in the doorway of the living room, her face pale and drawn, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why, Daniel? Why would you do this?" I set my glass down, meeting her gaze with a steady calm. "Because you lied, Lauren. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family, and you thought you could get away with it. But actions have consequences, and now you're facing yours." Her shoulders slumped, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've destroyed everything," she whispered. "No, Lauren," I said, my voice cold. "You did that all on your own. I just made sure the truth came out." As she turned and walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief. The charade was over, the truth laid bare for all to see. And while the road ahead would be messy, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the villain in this story. She was. And now everyone knew it. Monday morning came with a heavy, expectant silence. Lauren left the house early, her face pale and tight with tension. She didn't say goodbye, didn't even glance in my direction. I watched her pull out of the driveway, her usual confidence replaced by a frantic energy that made her hands shake when she gripped the wheel. The boys asked why she seemed upset, their innocent questions cutting deeper than I expected. I told them she was dealing with a lot at work, knowing it was only a matter of time before they'd start piecing things together. Children might not understand the intricacies of adult problems, but they feel the shifts, the cracks that form beneath the surface. I spent the day fielding fallout. My phone buzzed constantly. Emails, messages, calls, all from the recipients of the Lauren's Truth email. Most of them were shocked, some angry, a few sympathetic. Her parents called first, their voices filled with equal parts confusion and disappointment. Her mother sobbed, begging me to reconsider, while her father asked if there was any way to keep this within the family. I told them the truth. Lauren had made this public by her actions, not me. Later, I got a call from Lauren's boss. He didn't mince words, saying her position at the company was now under review due to the potential impact on their reputation. The professional consequences of her affair weren't just theoretical anymore. They were real, and they were unfolding faster than I'd anticipated. When Lauren finally came home that evening, she looked like she'd aged a decade in a single day. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes rimmed red from crying, and her usually immaculate outfit was wrinkled and disheveled. She dropped her bag by the door and slumped onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I watched her from the kitchen, a cold detachment settling over me. This was the woman who had spent months lying to my face, sneaking around behind my back, and painting herself as the victim in her own story. Now, stripped of her armor, she was just a hollow shell of the person I'd once loved. She didn't speak until hours later, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet. She found me in the living room, where I sat with my laptop, finishing up work that had taken a back seat to the chaos of the past few days. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk." I didn't look up. "I don't think there's anything left to say, Lauren." She stepped closer, wringing her hands. "I know you're angry. I know I made mistakes, but you've taken this too far. You've humiliated me." I finally looked at her, my expression cold. "You humiliated yourself, Lauren." I just showed everyone what was already there. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down entirely. But instead, she straightened, a flicker of defiance sparking in her eyes. "You think this makes you better than me? Ruining my life, dragging our family through the mud? You're no better than I am." I stood, towering over her, my voice low and steady. "Don't you dare compare us. I didn't lie. I didn't cheat. I didn't destroy the trust our family was built on. You did. And now you're facing the consequences." She flinched but didn't respond, her gaze dropping to the floor. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Then she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the darkened room. The next day, Lauren stayed home from work. She claimed she wasn't feeling well, but I knew the truth. She was avoiding the fallout. I let her be, focusing on my own responsibilities and giving her the space to stew in her own guilt. But I wasn't done yet. Using the evidence I'd gathered, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers. The post-nuptial agreement Lauren had signed years ago gave me the upper hand, ensuring that the house, the finances, and custody of the boys would remain firmly under my control. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about securing a stable future for my sons and me. Jim, my lawyer, leaned back in his chair, studying the documents. "This is solid, Daniel. She'll have a hard time fighting this in court." "Good," I said, my voice firm. "I'm done playing games." That evening, I sat down with Lauren in the kitchen. The boys were at a friend's house, and the house was quiet, save for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I slid the divorce papers across the table, my expression unreadable. She stared at the documents, her hands trembling. "You're serious," she whispered. I nodded, dead serious. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't let myself feel anything. I'd spent too long giving her the benefit of the doubt, too long believing in a version of her that no longer existed. She looked up at me, her voice breaking. "What about the boys? They deserve better than this," I said simply. "Better than a marriage built on lies." She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded, her tears spilling over. "I'll sign them," she said softly. "But just know, Daniel, this will change everything." I met her gaze, my voice steady. "It already has." As I watched her sign the papers, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The fight wasn't over, but the end was finally in sight. Lauren thought she could rewrite the rules, that she could twist the truth to suit her narrative. But now, for the first time, the truth was mine to tell. And I wasn't going to let her take it away. The divorce papers were signed, but the sense of finality I'd expected didn't come. Instead, the fallout of Lauren's actions rippled outward, touching every corner of her life. Her friends, her colleagues, her family, they all knew now. The web of lies she'd spun had unraveled. leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Lauren's boss called her into the office the day after she signed the papers. She came home later that evening, her eyes red, her shoulders slumped. I didn't ask what had happened. I didn't need to. The email I'd sent had included evidence of how she'd used company time and resources to carry on her affair. She'd been placed on indefinite leave, pending a review. It wasn't an outright firing, but it was close enough. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers, the reality of her new life sinking in. I wanted to feel pity for her, to reach out and offer some kind of comfort, but I couldn't. She'd chosen this path, and now she had to walk it alone. The boys were starting to pick up on the tension, their questions becoming harder to dodge. One night, as I tucked Maddie into bed, he looked up at me with wide, searching eyes. "Is Mommy mad at you?" he asked softly. I sat on the edge of his bed, my chest tightening. "Mommy and I are going through some things," I said carefully. "But we both love you very much, and that's never going to change." He nodded, but I could see the worry in his expression. I ruffled his hair, forcing a smile. "It's going to be okay, buddy. I promise." The next weekend, Lauren's parents came over unannounced. Her mother was tearful, her father tight-lipped, his disappointment radiating like heat. They'd read the email, seen the evidence, and now they wanted answers. Lauren tried to downplay it, blaming stress, the pressures of work, and our supposed communication issues. But her father wasn't buying it. He cut her off mid-sentence, his voice sharp and cutting. "Stop making excuses, Lauren. You betrayed your family. You betrayed your husband. Own it." I watched from the sidelines, saying nothing. It wasn't my battle to fight anymore. Lauren's lies had caught up with her, and she was finally being held accountable. That night, after her parents left, Lauren sat on the couch, staring blankly at the television. I joined her, sitting on the opposite end, the silence between us heavy. "You were right," she said suddenly, her voice hollow. "About everything. About me." I didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Words wouldn't change that. She looked over at me, her eyes filled with a pain I couldn't bring myself to care about. I thought I could handle it. The lies, the guilt. But I can't. It's too much. I leaned back, my expression unreadable. "You thought you could have it all, Lauren. That you could rewrite the rules and walk away unscathed. But life doesn't work like that." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know. I don't know how to fix it." "You can't," I said simply. "Some things can't be fixed." The days that followed were a blur of logistics and strained conversations. We began the process of dividing assets, figuring out custody arrangements, and navigating the new reality of our lives. Lauren moved into a small apartment across town, her once perfect world reduced to a shadow of what it had been. The boys stayed with me most of the time, their routines unchanged except for the absence of their mother at the dinner table. Lauren had visitation rights, but she rarely used them, her shame and guilt keeping her at a distance. One evening, as I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Grant Reynolds. "Jason, I've lost everything. My wife, my job, my reputation. If you were looking for revenge, you've succeeded. But if you ever cared about Lauren, even a little, let this end. We've all suffered enough." I stared at the message for a long time, my mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Grant was right. He'd lost everything, just like Lauren. But their suffering wasn't my responsibility. They'd brought this on themselves. I deleted the message without responding. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The lies, the betrayal, the chaos, it was all behind me now. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I knew one thing for certain. I'd come out stronger on the other side. And as I sat there, the cool evening breeze brushing against my face, I realized something else. This wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning. For me, for my boys, and for the life we were going to build together. In the weeks that followed, I tried to focus on rebuilding. The house felt quieter, but not in a bad way. Without Lauren's lingering presence, there was no tension, no walking on eggshells. It was just me and the boys, and though the routine was busier than ever, it was also simpler. Maddie started to smile more, to laugh again. Slowly, We were finding our new normal. But even as I tried to move forward, there were reminders of Lauren's betrayal lurking in the corners. Mutual friends, now distant and unsure of where their loyalties lay, sent occasional texts. Some sided with Lauren, buying into her narrative of a marriage that had been cold and distant long before Sam entered the picture. Others reached out to offer their support, their messages filled with apologies for not seeing the cracks sooner. One day, while cleaning out the garage, I found an old box of keepsakes. Inside were photos from our wedding, letters we'd written each other, and mementos from the life we'd built together. I should have felt something, nostalgia, sadness, maybe even regret. But instead, I felt nothing. I stared at a photo of us on our honeymoon, the sun setting behind us as we laughed at something I couldn't even remember now. I was smiling so wide, so full of hope, so certain of the future we were building. I barely recognized the man in the picture. Later that week, Jim, my lawyer, called with an update. The divorce had been finalized, the custody arrangement set in stone. Lauren hadn't contested anything. She'd signed every document without hesitation, as if she knew there was no point in fighting. That should have been the end of it. But there was still one loose thread I couldn't ignore: the offshore account. Jim's voice was cautious as he outlined the details. The account Lauren had set up with Sam hadn't just been used to hide their affair. It had also been used to siphon money from her workplace. The company had discovered the discrepancies, and now Lauren was under investigation for embezzlement. I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, processing the weight of his words. Lauren hadn't just betrayed me. She destroyed her career, her reputation, and potentially her freedom. Do they have enough to press charges? I asked, my voice calm. Jim hesitated. They're building a case, but it's still early. If they move forward, it'll be a long process. I nodded, my grip tightening on the phone. Keep me updated. That evening, I decided to confront Lauren one last time. Not to argue or rehash old wounds, but to give her a chance to explain herself. I wasn't looking for closure. I'd already found that, but I wanted to hear it from her lips. Why she'd risked everything. What she'd hoped to gain. She agreed to meet me at a small cafe near her apartment. When I arrived, she was already there, her face pale, her hands fidgeting with the edges of her napkin. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything she'd done had finally caught up with her. I sat across from her, my expression unreadable. She didn't speak right away, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Thank you for coming," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Daniel. I've done terrible things, things I can't take back. But I need you to know, none of it was because I didn't love you." I stared at her, my jaw tightening. "Love? Is that what you call this?" She flinched, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I made mistakes. I let myself believe that I needed more, that I deserved more. But I was wrong. I ruined everything, and I have to live with that." Her words felt hollow, like she was reciting lines from a script she didn't believe in. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You didn't just ruin our marriage, Lauren. You risked everything, your career, your reputation, even your freedom. What were you thinking?" She shook her head, her tears falling faster. "I wasn't thinking, Daniel. I was selfish and stupid, and I thought I could get away with it. I thought I could have it all." I leaned back, studying her for a long moment. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the same person I'd married. She was a stranger, a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily things could fall apart when you stopped paying attention. I stood, tossing a few bills on the table for the coffee I hadn't touched. "Good luck, Lauren. You're going to need it." As I walked out of the cafe, the weight on my chest began to lift. I'd said my piece, given her a chance to explain. And while her words hadn't offered any real answers, they'd solidified one thing for me. I was done. The loose threads were tied, the story finished. Now it was time to turn the page. Life after Lauren felt like learning to walk again. Tentative, wobbly steps toward a future I wasn't sure I was ready for. The divorce was finalized, her presence in the house reduced to faint echoes, and the boys were adjusting better than I'd expected. They miss their mother, of course, but kids are resilient. They adapted quickly, finding joy in the smallest things while I tried to do the same. One evening, as I sorted through old paperwork in the garage, I found a folder filled with plans I'd scribbled years ago, ideas for a side business building custom furniture. It had been a pipe dream back then, something I'd never found the time or courage to pursue. But now, with the house quieter and my evenings free, I started to wonder if it wasn't time to dust off those plans. The next day, I took the first step. I visited a local hardware store, buying tools and supplies I hadn't touched in years. That weekend, while the boys played in the backyard, I built my first piece, a simple bookshelf. It wasn't perfect, the edges were uneven, the stain a little too dark, but it was mine, a tangible result of my effort. The process was cathartic. Each cut of the saw, each swing of the hammer, was a way to channel the frustration and anger that had consumed me for so long. By the time I finished the bookshelf, I felt lighter, as though I'd left a piece of my pain in the wood. Meanwhile, Lauren's life continued to unravel. The investigation into the offshore account gained traction, and whispers of her potential indictment spread through our circle of acquaintances. I didn't gloat, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. The boys saw her less frequently, her visits becoming sporadic as the weight of her circumstances pressed down on her. When she did come by, she was polite but distant, her interactions with me reduced to curt exchanges of information about schedules and school events. One evening, as she picked up the boys for a rare overnight visit, she paused at the door, her eyes searching mine. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly, "for everything you've done for the boys. I know I've made it harder than it needed to be." I nodded, not trusting myself to respond. She left without another word, her footsteps fading into the night. As the months passed, I found myself focusing less on the past and more on the future. The furniture building hobby turned into a small business, with word of mouth spreading faster than I'd anticipated. Orders trickled in, then flooded, until I had to carve out a dedicated workspace in the garage just to keep up. The boys loved it too. They'd sit with me while I worked, asking questions, handing me tools, and occasionally trying their hand at sanding or staining. It became our thing, a way to bond and rebuild our family in a new way. One afternoon, as Maddie and I loaded a finished table into a customer's truck, he looked up at me and grinned. "You got a real talent, man. Ever think about going full-time with this?" The question caught me off guard, but it stayed with me long after he drove away. I hadn't considered it. Not seriously anyway. But as I looked around at the workshop I'd built, the piles of wood and tools and finished pieces stacked neatly in the corner, I realized it wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a new chapter, a way to move forward. That evening, as the boys and I sat down for dinner, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The scars of Lauren's betrayal were still there, faint reminders of the life we'd lost, but they didn't define me anymore. I was more than the man she'd cheated on, more than the husband she'd discarded. I was a father, a builder, a man who had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. And as I looked across the table at my sons, laughing and joking with each other, I realized something else. We weren't just surviving. We were thriving. The first anniversary of my divorce came and went quietly. No fanfare, no bitterness, just a calm sense of finality. The life I'd built with Lauren was firmly behind me now, a closed chapter in a book I no longer needed to read. My focus had shifted entirely to the life I was building, not just for myself, but for Maddie and his younger brother Ethan. The boys were flourishing. Maddie had joined a soccer league and started spending more time drawing in his sketchbook, a passion I hadn't realized he had until now. Ethan had become my little shadow, following me around the workshop and asking a million questions about everything I was building. They were the light in my life, the reason I kept pushing forward even when the weight of everything threatened to pull me back. The business, which I'd tentatively named Carter Crafts, was thriving. What started as a few custom furniture orders from neighbors and friends had grown into something much bigger. Local boutiques began carrying my pieces, and I'd even received inquiries from customers in nearby cities. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the pride that came with creating something real, something lasting. One evening, as I was sanding down a new dining table, Maddie came into the workshop holding a piece of paper. "Dad," he said, "can we put this on the fridge?" I set down the sander and took the paper from him. It was a crayon drawing of me and the boys standing in front of the workshop smiling. Above it, in big, shaky letters, he'd written Carter Crafts, "Best Dad Ever." My throat tightened, and I pulled him into a hug. "Of course, buddy. This is the best thing I've ever seen." As the business grew, so did my confidence. I started taking on bigger projects, branching out into designs I'd never attempted before. The process was challenging but rewarding, and every success felt like another step toward reclaiming my sense of self. Even Lauren began to take notice. During one of her visits with the boys, she saw one of my pieces, a sleek, modern coffee table I'd just finished, and raised an eyebrow. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" she said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe, or envy. I nodded, keeping my tone even. "Yeah, I am." She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "I'm glad. You deserve it." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond. By the end of the year, I'd outgrown the garage. A local contractor I'd worked with offered me a deal on a small warehouse space, and after some careful budgeting, I made the leap. The new space was a game changer, allowing me to take on larger orders and even hire a part-time assistant to help with the workload. The boys loved the warehouse. Maddie painted a mural on one of the walls, a sprawling forest scene with animals peeking out from behind trees, and Ethan declared himself the official supervisor, complete with a clipboard and hard hat. One day, while working on a particularly intricate cabinet design, I received an email from a major online retailer. They'd seen my work through a boutique that carried my pieces and were interested in a potential partnership. The idea of scaling my business to that level was both exhilarating and terrifying, but I knew I couldn't pass up the opportunity. As I drafted my response, I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. My focus was entirely on the future, on the possibilities that lay ahead. That evening, as I sat on the couch with Maddie and Ethan, watching a movie, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road to this point hadn't been easy. It had been messy and painful, and filled with moments where I wasn't sure I'd ever feel whole again. But now, as I looked at my sons, at the life we were building together, I knew it had all been worth it. Lauren's betrayal had shattered me, but it hadn't defined me. I'd picked up the pieces, built something new, and come out stronger on the other side. I wasn't the man I'd been before, and that was okay. I was someone better. As the credits rolled and Maddie fell asleep against my shoulder, I smiled to myself. This was my new beginning, a life filled with love, resilience, and the knowledge that no matter what came next, we'd face it together. Because we weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. So, what do you think about my story? Drop a comment with your thoughts on my decision and how you would have handled it.